She was 22 years old when she arrived in California. No one remembers the exact day she decided to go there. There was no dramatic departure, no farewell scene, no sense that something irreversible had begun. She traveled light. She moved often. She stayed where she could. By the time she reached Los Angeles, she was already accustomed to being temporary. In the months before her death, Elizabeth Short drifted between cities, homes, and acquaintances. She slept on couches. She stayed in rented rooms. She relied on the generosity of people who knew her only briefly. This was not unusual in post-war America. The country was in motion. Cities swelled with returning servicemen, hopeful transplants, and people chasing work or reinvention. Los Angeles was full of them. Elizabeth Short did not stand out at first. She was described as polite, quiet, careful. Those who met her remembered her appearance, but they also remembered her reserve. She did not confide easily. She did not anchor herself to a single place or person. She had been in California before. She left. She came back again. By early January of 1947, she was living on borrowed time in a borrowed city. She had no permanent address. She had no job. She had no immediate plans beyond the next few days. This is where most accounts begin to distort her story. They turn her movement into mystery. They assign motives without evidence. They fill gaps with assumptions. What is documented is simpler and more fragile. On January 9th, Elizabeth Short was seen in San Diego. She had been staying with acquaintances. That morning, she boarded a bus heading north toward Los Angeles. She told people she was meeting someone. She did not say who. Later that day, she was seen at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. She sat in the lobby. She made phone calls. She waited. This is the last confirmed public sighting of Elizabeth Short. What happened after that has never been established with certainty. There were no witnesses who saw her leave the hotel. No confirmed record of where she went next. No evidence of who she met, if anyone. For nearly a week, she vanished into the city without leaving a trace. Los Angeles in 1947 was vast and porous. People disappeared easily, especially those without fixed residences or close family nearby. No missing persons report was immediately filed. No alarm was raised. She did not yet exist as a case. On the morning of January 15th, a woman was walking with her child along a vacant lot in the Lamert Park neighborhood of Los Angeles. The area was undeveloped. Open land broken by scrub and uneven ground. At first, she thought she was looking at a discarded mannequin. The object was pale, still, unnaturally arranged. When she realized it was not artificial, she did not approach it. She went for help. Police arrived within minutes. What they found did not resemble anything they had encountered before. The body was posed deliberately, placed, not discarded, positioned in a way that immediately suggested intention. It was clean, drained of visible blood, marked by injuries that were precise rather than chaotic. Even before identification, investigators knew this was not a spontaneous act. It was controlled. The press arrived quickly. So did photographers. The photographs taken that morning would circulate for decades. They would become inseparable from the case itself. Elizabeth Short was identified later that day. From that moment forward, her name ceased to belong to her alone. It became public property. The press gave her a nickname almost immediately. It was catchy. It was cruel. It would outlive her. The investigation began under intense scrutiny. Within hours, reporters outnumbered detectives at the scene. Details leaked before they were verified. Speculation outran evidence. The Los Angeles Police Department faced a problem they could not contain. The crime itself was extraordinary, but the environment surrounding it was worse. Tips poured in from across the city. Confessions arrived by mail and phone. Some were hoaxes, some were delusions, some were impossible to verify. Investigators were forced to triage information in real time while the public watched. This pressure distorted priorities. Instead of narrowing possibilities, the case expanded uncontrollably. One detail at a time, the shape of the crime became clearer. The condition of the body indicated planning. The absence of blood suggested the location where she was found was not the location where she was killed. The lack of defensive wounds suggested she may not have been conscious for the final stage of the act. These were not conclusions drawn quickly. They emerged slowly through careful examination. But the public did not wait for careful conclusions. The narrative was already forming. Elizabeth Short's life was dissected publicly within days. Her movements were scrutinized. Her relationships were exaggerated. Her personality was rewritten to suit the story people wanted to tell. This rewriting obscured more than it revealed. Because the truth of her final days was quieter, more ordinary, more difficult to dramatize, police reconstructed her movements as best they could. They tracked her stays. They interviewed acquaintances. They pieced together a fragmented timeline, but there were holes everywhere. Elizabeth Short had lived transiently. She had relied on people she had known briefly. She did not leave behind a trail that could be followed easily. This was not suspicious behavior. It was survival, yet it made her vulnerable. As days passed, investigators began to realize something else. The person responsible had likely anticipated the response. The body was placed in a visible location. The injuries were unmistakable. The presentation ensured discovery. This was not concealment, it was communication. At the same time, no direct message accompanied the act. No note was left at the scene. No immediate claim of responsibility appeared. This absence complicated interpretation. Was the act meant to shock or to taunt or simply to be seen? The answer would not become clear for some time. As the investigation progressed, police began receiving items through the mail. Some were letters, some were objects. Not all were authentic. Sorting truth from manipulation became its own challenge. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Short's family learned of her death through the press. They were not notified privately. They encountered her story already reshaped by headlines. This was not unusual at the time, but it compounded the harm. Her identity had been reduced to an image and a nickname before she could be mourned. By the end of the first week, the case had already slipped out of control. Investigators were working with limited forensic tools. They lacked technology that modern cases rely on. They depended on witness testimony, physical reconstruction, and intuition. None of these were sufficient on their own, and time was already working against them. As the days passed, investigators began to focus less on who Elizabeth Short had been and more on how the crime had been carried out. This shift was not accidental. The brutality of the act demanded technical explanation before personal motive. The examination revealed that the injuries were not random. They followed patterns. They suggested familiarity with anatomy, not necessarily professional training, but comfort, confidence. The body had been thoroughly cleaned. This was not the result of weather or chance. It required time, water, privacy. Where that had happened remained unknown. The positioning of the body suggested intent beyond disposal. The limbs were arranged deliberately. The placement ensured visibility from the road. Nothing was left to accident. Investigators believed the killer wanted the body to be found exactly as it was. Attention turned to possible locations where the crime could have occurred. Private residences, vacant buildings, medical facilities, industrial spaces. Los Angeles in 1947 offered countless possibilities. The city was expanding rapidly. Construction sites dotted the outskirts. Abandoned structures were common. Access did not require explanation. Meanwhile, the press continued to release details that investigators wished to keep private. Specific injuries were described publicly. Theories were printed as fact. The line between evidence and rumor blurred. This had consequences. Individuals began coming forward with false confessions. Some were seeking attention. Others were mentally unstable. A few were attempting to insert themselves into history. Each confession required investigation. Each consumed time and resources. One letter, however, stood apart. It arrived at a newspaper office days after the body was discovered. The sender claimed responsibility. The tone was calm, controlled, almost proud. Along with the letter came personal items that had belonged to Elizabeth Short. This changed the case. The items were authentic. They had not been publicly described. Only the killer or someone with direct access could have sent them. The sender promised further communication. Investigators were now dealing with someone who wanted engagement. More letters followed, each carefully worded, each avoiding specifics that could conclusively identify the writer, each reinforcing the sense of control. Despite extensive handwriting analysis, no match was ever confirmed. The trail stalled. Police shifted strategy again. They began compiling a list of individuals who had interacted with Elizabeth Short in the weeks before her death. Friends, acquaintances, people who had offered temporary shelter. Dozens of names surfaced. Most were ruled out quickly. Some remained ambiguous. The difficulty lay in proximity without documentation. She had been transient. Her movements were not formally recorded. She had stayed where she could. One man, in particular, attracted attention. He had spent time with her shortly before her disappearance. He had traveled with her. He had been one of the last people known to see her alive. He cooperated fully with investigators. His account was consistent. No physical evidence connected him to the crime. He was eventually cleared. This pattern repeated. People came into focus briefly, then receded. With each failed lead, the case grew colder. The lack of forensic certainty weighed heavily. No fingerprints matched. No eyewitnesses came forward. No definitive location of the killing was identified. What remained was inference. And inference was dangerous. As weeks turned into months, the investigation became increasingly fragmented. Original detectives were reassigned. Files were reorganized. Momentum faded. Yet the case refused to disappear. Every few years, new suspects emerged. Some were physicians, some were artists, some were criminals already known to law enforcement. Each theory rested on circumstantial connections. None produced conclusive proof. One suspect gained particular attention decades later. He was intelligent, well-educated, socially connected. He had known Elizabeth Short. He had spoken about the case. He had displayed disturbing behavior. Investigators examined him thoroughly. They found inconsistencies. They found troubling patterns. But they found no evidence strong enough to charge him. He denied involvement until his death. Other suspects followed similar arcs, compelling on paper, inconclusive in reality. As time passed, the original physical evidence degraded or was lost. Records were misplaced. Memories faded. What remained were photographs, reports, fragments. The case became a mirror for those who studied it. Some saw a calculating predator. Others saw institutional failure. Some saw cultural obsession overshadowing truth. Elizabeth Short herself became increasingly abstract. She was discussed more than understood. This abstraction allowed myths to grow. Her life was simplified into caricature. Her death became a symbol rather than an event, yet the facts never changed. She was alone. She was vulnerable. She was killed deliberately. The killer was never identified. The Los Angeles Police Department would later acknowledge errors in the investigation. Information had been released too freely. Opportunities had been missed. Focus had been lost. But acknowledgement did not produce answers. The case remained officially unsolved. The years following the initial investigation did not bring clarity. They brought distance. As evidence aged, the case transitioned from an active pursuit to an unresolved record. Physical materials were preserved where possible, but standards of storage and documentation in the late 1940s were inconsistent. Some items degraded, others were misplaced, a few were lost entirely. What remained were photographs, autopsy reports, interview transcripts, and internal memoranda. Together, they formed a fragmented archive that future investigators would revisit repeatedly. One of the most persistent challenges was the absence of a confirmed crime scene. Without knowing where Elizabeth Short had been killed, investigators could not reconstruct a definitive sequence of events. They could not establish who had access to the location. They could not test environmental traces. This uncertainty allowed speculation to flourish. Over time, individuals with tangential connections to Elizabeth Short were re-examined. Some were former acquaintances. Others were men who had expressed interest in her. A few were individuals whose backgrounds or behaviors appeared troubling when viewed retrospectively. None could be conclusively linked to the crime. Several suspects gained prominence decades later through investigative journalism and memoirs. These theories often relied on circumstantial evidence, psychological profiling, or retrospective interpretation of behavior. While compelling to readers, they did not meet the evidentiary standards required for legal action. Law enforcement agencies acknowledged that mistakes had been made early in the investigation. Sensitive details were released prematurely. This compromised potential confessions and contaminated witness testimony. False leads proliferated. Resources were diverted. The media played a significant role in shaping public perception. Headlines emphasized brutality over fact. Elizabeth Short was portrayed through sensationalized narratives rather than documented reality. This distortion obscured the investigation rather than advancing it. The letters sent to newspapers were repeatedly analyzed. Handwriting experts disagreed. Linguistic patterns were inconclusive. No definitive link to a suspect was established. As forensic science advanced, renewed efforts were made to apply modern techniques to preserved evidence. DNA testing was attempted on limited materials. The results did not yield usable profiles. Time had eroded what science required. By the late 20th century, the case had effectively become dormant. No active investigative unit was assigned. New information was scarce. What endured was the cultural imprint. Elizabeth Short became a symbol rather than an individual. Her name was invoked in films, novels, and documentaries. Often, these portrayals emphasized mystery and menace rather than accuracy. This had consequences. The more the story was retold, the further it drifted from verified fact. Speculation hardened into assumption. Assumption became belief, yet the documented truths remained stark. Elizabeth Short was 22 years old. She had no known criminal history. She had not been under investigation. She had not been living a clandestine life. She was found murdered. Her killer was never identified. The case exposed systemic vulnerabilities. It demonstrated how investigative momentum can be lost, how information overload can obscure truth, how public pressure can distort priorities. It also revealed how easily a victim can be reduced to a narrative device. Elizabeth Short did not choose the name by which she is remembered. She did not shape the image that followed her death. Those were constructed after the fact. The absence of resolution has led some to assume inevitability, that the truth was unknowable, that the killer disappeared without trace. This assumption may be comforting, but it is not necessarily accurate. What failed was not certainty. What failed was containment. The investigation unfolded in a city expanding faster than its institutions could adapt. Jurisdictional overlap, inconsistent record-keeping, limited forensic capacity, all of these factors compounded. The Black Dahlia case persists because it sits at the intersection of violence and visibility. The crime was extreme. The presentation was deliberate. The discovery was public. Yet beyond that moment, everything diffused. No confession was verified. No arrest was sustained. No definitive theory prevailed. What remains is an unresolved absence at the center of a heavily documented event. Elizabeth Short's death altered procedures within law enforcement. Protocols for evidence handling were revised. Media cooperation policies were reconsidered. Lessons were learned, albeit late, but learning does not equate to justice. The passage of time has rendered prosecution impossible. Potential suspects have died. Witnesses are gone. Physical evidence is compromised. The case now exists as history rather than inquiry, and history does not answer questions. It records that they were asked. The enduring discomfort of the Black Dahlia case lies not in its brutality alone. It lies in its ordinariness. There was no dramatic pursuit, no moment of revelation, no clear antagonist. There was only a sequence of failures and silences. Elizabeth Short's life did not culminate in her death. Her death overshadowed her life. She remains remembered not for who she was, but for how she was found. That imbalance is part of the harm. The case serves as a reminder that not all crimes conclude with understanding. Some remain unresolved not because the truth is inaccessible, but because it was buried under excess. Excess information, excess noise, excess narrative. What endures is a single, undeniable fact. A young woman was killed. The person responsible was never held accountable. Everything else is interpretation. And that is why the case still unsettles, not because it is mysterious, but because it is incomplete.